When police searched 16-year-old Sophie Martinez's laptop, they found something that made their blood run cold. Months of Google searches detailing exactly how to poison someone and get away with it. How to make thallium untraceable. Symptoms of slow poisoning. Can autopsy detect heavy metals? But the most damning evidence wouldn't come from investigators. It would come from the one person who had been watching her research murder methods in real time. Her own chemistry teacher. Sophie Martinez was the perfect daughter. Straight-A student, debate team captain, national merit scholar headed for the Ivy League. Her parents, Michael and Catherine, had given her everything, loved her unconditionally, and never imagined that the greatest threat to their lives was living under their own roof. But as they lay dying in the hospital, victim to a mysterious illness that doctors couldn't explain, a high school teacher named Robert Chen sat at the police station with a manila folder full of internet search logs that would expose the horrifying truth about what their brilliant daughter had been planning in his chemistry class. The Martinez family lived in the affluent Bellevue neighborhood of Seattle, Washington, in a spacious home that represented everything they had worked for. Michael Martinez, 48, was a successful architect whose firm had designed several prominent buildings throughout the metro area. His wife, Catherine, 45, was a pediatric nurse beloved by her patients. They had built a life of comfort and security, and their only child, Sophie, was their greatest achievement, a brilliant teenager who seemed destined for greatness. They had no idea that the same mind that earned perfect grades was calculating how to end their lives. The nightmare began on a Tuesday evening in late September when Michael arrived home from work violently ill. Severe nausea, dizziness, profuse sweating, rapid heartbeat, and uncontrollable vomiting sent Catherine rushing him to the emergency room. Doctors ran extensive tests, searching for the cause of his alarming symptoms. Everything pointed to severe food poisoning, though more extreme than typical cases. After 2 days of treatment, he stabilized and was released, with doctors attributing his illness to contaminated food from a business lunch. It seemed like terrible luck, nothing more. 3 weeks later, Catherine herself collapsed with identical symptoms. The same emergency room physician who had treated her husband now faced a disturbing coincidence. He ordered more comprehensive testing, but standard toxicology panels came back negative. Catherine spent a week in the hospital, weak and confused, before recovering enough to go home. Doctors suggested environmental contamination, perhaps mold or a gas leak, and the family hired specialists who found nothing. The Martinez family seemed to be experiencing an inexplicable run of medical disasters. Throughout both crises, Sophie had been the model of devotion. She brought her parents soup and tea, helped them when they were too weak to walk, and even missed school to care for them. Teachers praised her dedication, classmates admired her strength, and her parents thanked God for such a caring daughter. No one suspected that the same hands offering comfort were the ones administering the poison that was slowly destroying their bodies. The third incident shattered any possibility of coincidence. In mid-November, both parents collapsed simultaneously. Michael was found convulsing in his office, foam at his mouth. Catherine never made it to work, discovered unconscious at the bottom of her stairs by a concerned neighbor. Both were rushed to Harborview Medical Center, where the trauma team fought to save their lives. This time, Dr. Sarah Patel, the attending physician, refused to accept bad luck as an explanation. She ordered an expanded toxicology panel, testing for substances far beyond standard screening, including exotic compounds and heavy metals rarely seen in civilian poisonings. The results came back 48 hours later with a chilling confirmation. Both patients had dangerously elevated levels of thallium in their systems. Thallium, a toxic heavy metal once used in rat poison but now heavily restricted, is an insidious killer. Its symptoms mimic dozens of other conditions, and it accumulates in the body over time, making it perfect for someone seeking slow, undetectable murder. The discovery transformed a medical mystery into a criminal investigation, and Seattle police detectives were immediately contacted. Detective Maria Santos understood immediately what thallium poisoning meant. Deliberate, calculated attempted murder. Someone had been systematically poisoning Michael and Catherine Martinez over months, carefully dosing them to cause suffering without immediate death. The question was, who had both access and motive? The answer would lead directly to their own daughter. Forensic specialists treated the Martinez home as a crime scene, testing everything: food, beverages, medications, cleaning supplies, personal items. The breakthrough came in Sophie's private bathroom, hidden beneath cosmetics at the back of a drawer. A small glass vial containing crystalline thallium sulfate, enough to kill dozens of people. The discovery was chilling. This wasn't impulse or passion. This was premeditated, methodical murder, and only Sophie had access to that bathroom. Sophie was arrested the next day, pulled from her advanced placement chemistry class by detectives with a warrant. Her reaction was textbook denial, shock, tears, protestations of innocence. She claimed she'd never seen the vial, that someone must have planted it, that this was a horrible mistake. Her performance was convincing, tears flowing as she insisted on her love for her parents. But Detective Santos recognized the calculated quality of Sophie's distress, the way her grief seemed performative, switching on and off as she gauged the detective's reactions. The case was strong but incomplete. They had poison in her possession, opportunity and access, but they lacked clear evidence of how a 16-year-old had obtained such a restricted substance. Thallium compounds aren't available to the public, heavily regulated due to extreme toxicity. How had a high school student acquired such a dangerous chemical? The answer would come from an unexpected source: her chemistry teacher. Robert Chen had been teaching high school chemistry for 15 years, priding himself on truly knowing his students. Sophie had been in his AP chemistry class since September, and he'd always found her exceptional, engaged, curious, meticulous in lab work. But in late August, about a month before her father's first illness, something had troubled him. During free work time, he noticed Sophie intensely focused on her laptop. Walking past her desk, he glanced at her screen and saw an article titled "Undetectable Poisons: A Historical Perspective." At the time, Mr. Chen hadn't thought much of it. Students often went down research rabbit holes, and chemistry students were particularly fascinated by the darker applications of science. But he made a mental note, a small flag registering as unusual but not alarming. Over the following weeks, Sophie's internet searches during class continued along similar themes: heavy metal toxicity, thallium poisoning symptoms, historical cases of poisoners who evaded detection, and most disturbingly, forum discussions about acquiring restricted chemicals for research purposes. Each time, Mr. Chen felt growing unease, but struggled with whether he was overreacting, seeing sinister intent where there was only academic curiosity. The moment that crystallized his concern came in mid-September, days before Michael Martinez's first hospitalization. Sophie approached him after class with a question that, in retrospect, was a clear red flag. She asked with studied casualness about the school's chemical inventory, specifically whether they had any thallium compounds for demonstration purposes. Mr. Chen, taken aback, explained that the school didn't keep such dangerous substances, that they used safer alternatives. Sophie nodded, thanked him, and left, but the interaction nagged at his consciousness. When news broke that Sophie Martinez had been arrested for attempted murder of her parents by thallium poisoning, Robert Chen felt his blood run cold. All those small observations, all those dismissed concerns suddenly snapped into horrifying focus. He immediately contacted Seattle police and requested to speak with detectives handling the case. His testimony would prove to be the missing piece that transformed circumstantial evidence into an ironclad prosecution. At the police station, Mr. Chen provided Detective Santos with a detailed timeline of Sophie's suspicious behavior, but more importantly, he provided concrete evidence. After noticing Sophie's unusual research patterns, Mr. Chen had begun documenting her internet activity during class periods. The school's network monitoring system kept logs of all websites visited on school computers. Mr. Chen had requested and saved these logs for his class periods, a decision that would prove crucial. The logs showed an extensive and damning pattern of research on poisons, their effects, acquisition methods, and administration techniques that evaded detection. The prosecution team, led by Senior Deputy Prosecutor Jennifer Walsh, recognized immediately that Mr. Chen's testimony would be the centerpiece of their case. Sophie's defense attorney, Margaret Holloway, had built her strategy around arguing Sophie was being framed, that the poison had been planted, and that there was no evidence proving Sophie had the knowledge or means to commit such a sophisticated crime. Mr. Chen's testimony would obliterate that defense, providing a clear timeline of Sophie's knowledge acquisition, her research into methods, and her specific interest in thallium weeks before the first poisoning. As trial approached, Sophie maintained her facade of wounded innocence. She insisted she was falsely accused, that she loved her parents desperately, that she could never harm them. Her defense team coached her on courtroom behavior. Sit quietly, show sad eyes to the jury, project the image of a frightened child in a nightmare. For the first week of trial, the strategy seemed effective. Several jurors appeared sympathetic, visibly uncomfortable with prosecuting a teenage girl as a calculating poisoner. The prosecution methodically built their case. Medical experts testified about thallium poisoning, its symptoms, its accumulation over time. Forensic specialists described discovering the poison in Sophie's bathroom. Detective Santos walked the jury through the investigation timeline, the pattern of illnesses. But everything was building toward the moment when Robert Chen would take the stand, when the man who had watched Sophie's transformation from curious student to would-be murderer would tell his story. When Mr. Chen was called to testify, the courtroom atmosphere shifted palpably. Here was not a police officer or paid expert, but a teacher, someone whose job was nurturing young minds, being forced to condemn one of his own students. He walked to the witness stand with visible reluctance, his face reflecting the emotional burden of what he was about to do. Jennifer Walsh approached him gently, understanding this testimony was costing him something profound. "Mr. Chen, how long have you been teaching chemistry at Roosevelt High School?" 15 years, he replied, his voice steady but somber. "And was Sophie Martinez a student in your AP chemistry class?" "Yes, she was." "Can you describe Sophie as a student?" Mr. Chen paused, choosing words carefully. "Sophie was one of the brightest students I've ever taught. Exceptional intellect, perfect grades, deeply engaged with material. She was the kind of student every teacher hopes to have." Walsh let that statement hang in the air, establishing the tragedy of what was coming. "Mr. Chen, did there come a time when Sophie's behavior began to concern you?" "Yes." He looked down at his hands, then back at the prosecutor. "It started in late August. I noticed Sophie researching topics unusual for any class assignment, topics related to poisons." Over the next hour, Mr. Chen walked the jury through his observations, each more damning than the last. He described the progression of Sophie's research, from general articles about famous poisoners to specific technical papers about thallium compounds. He explained his decision to document her internet activity, his growing concern, his agonizing uncertainty about whether to report suspicions. Most devastatingly, he recounted Sophie's direct question about whether the school had thallium in its inventory. When she asked about thallium specifically, "What was your reaction?" Walsh asked. "I was surprised," Mr. Chen said. "Thallium isn't a compound we discuss in high school chemistry. It's not part of our curriculum. For a student to ask about it specifically, by name, was highly unusual. At the time, I told myself she was just intellectually curious, going beyond standard material. But it troubled me enough that I made a note of it." Walsh then introduced the internet search logs into evidence, projecting them on a large screen for the jury. The list was extensive and chilling. How to poison someone without getting caught. Thallium poisoning symptoms timeline. How long does thallium stay in the body? Buying thallium sulfate online. Rat poison with thallium, where to buy? Can thallium be detected in autopsy? And dozens more.
Each search was time-stamped, creating an irrefutable timeline corresponding exactly with the period before her parents' first illnesses. The jury's faces reflected their horror as they read through the searches. Several glanced at Sophie, who sat at the defense table, her carefully maintained expression of innocence beginning to crack under the weight of evidence. Her defense team coached her on courtroom behavior, but Sophie seemed frozen, staring at the screen displaying her own damning words. But Mr. Chen's testimony wasn't finished. Walsh had saved the most devastating piece for last. "Mr. Chen, did you notice any changes in Sophie's behavior after her parents became ill?" "Yes," he said quietly. After news broke about her parents' hospitalizations, Sophie came to class seemingly very composed, almost unnaturally so. Other students expressed concern, offered sympathy, but she seemed distant, detached. And then, about a week after her mother's second hospitalization, I noticed her researching something new. What was she researching? Mr. Chen's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. She was looking up articles about cases where poisoners had been acquitted due to lack of evidence. She was researching reasonable doubt, burden of proof, famous trials where defendants went free despite strong suspicion of guilt. She was preparing her defense before she was even arrested. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Patricia Morrison gavelled for silence. Sophie's face, which had maintained its mask of innocence throughout trial, finally showed a crack, a flash of something cold and calculating in her eyes before she forced her features back to neutrality. But the jury had seen it, that momentary glimpse of the real Sophie Martinez, the girl who had researched murdering her parents with the same meticulous attention she brought to schoolwork. Margaret Holloway faced an impossible task on cross-examination. She attempted to suggest Mr. Chen had misinterpreted innocent academic curiosity, that bright students often research dark topics without sinister intent. But Mr. Chen calmly refuted each suggestion, pointing out the specificity of Sophie's searches, the fact they focused not on chemistry of poisons in general, but on specific practicalities of committing undetected murder. When Holloway suggested search logs could have been fabricated, Mr. Chen provided original documentation from the school's IT department with complete digital signatures and timestamps that were independently verifiable. The final blow came when Walsh, on redirect examination, asked Mr. Chen a simple question. "In your 15 years of teaching, have you ever had another student research poisons the way Sophie did?" "Never," he said firmly. "I've had students interested in toxicology, forensic science, chemistry of various compounds, but I have never had a student research specifically how to kill someone and get away with it. That's not academic curiosity, that's planning." As Mr. Chen stepped down from the witness stand, Sophie Martinez's facade finally shattered completely. She leaned over to her attorney and whispered something urgently, her composure disintegrating. For the first time since arrest, the jury saw genuine emotion on her face, but it wasn't remorse or sorrow. It was rage, the cold fury of someone whose carefully laid plans had been exposed, whose intelligence and planning had been undone by a teacher who had simply been paying attention. The remainder of trial was almost anticlimactic. The defense had no effective rebuttal to Mr. Chen's testimony, no way to explain away documented evidence of Sophie's research and preparation. The prosecution rested with a powerful closing argument weaving together all the evidence: the poison in her possession, months of research into murder methods, her opportunity and access to her parents' food and drinks, and most damningly, her complete lack of emotional reaction to her parents' suffering, a coldness multiple witnesses had noted and found disturbing. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with their verdict. When the foreperson stood and announced guilty on all counts, attempted murder in the first degree for both parents, Sophie's reaction wasn't tears or denial, but visible deflation, as if all energy sustaining her performance of innocence simply drained away. Her parents, who had survived her murder attempts and were present in the courtroom, wept quietly, not with relief but with grief, for the daughter they had lost, not to death, but to something far darker. At the sentencing hearing 2 weeks later, the courtroom was packed with people struggling to comprehend how a 16-year-old honor student could commit such calculated evil. Michael and Catherine Martinez, still recovering from long-term effects of thallium poisoning, provided victim impact statements. Michael spoke of the betrayal, the knowledge that every meal his daughter prepared, every drink she brought him, was potentially poisoned. Catherine described nightmares, loss of trust, and the terrible question that would haunt them forever. Why?
The prosecution had uncovered a partial answer during investigation. Sophie's computer, seized as evidence, contained a journal documenting her resentment toward her parents. She felt smothered by their expectations, trapped by their dreams for her future, pressured to maintain perfection in every aspect of life. Rather than communicate her feelings, rather than seek help or simply rebel as countless teenagers do, Sophie had chosen murder, seeing it as the only way to free herself from their control while also inheriting their substantial estate. It was a motive as banal as it was horrifying. She killed not from abuse or desperation, but from entitlement and cold calculation. Judge Morrison, in her sentencing remarks, spoke directly to Sophie. "You are perhaps the most frightening defendant I have encountered in my 20 years on the bench. Not because you are violent or impulsive, but because you are the opposite. You are intelligent, patient, and methodical. You researched your crime like it was a school project. You documented your parents' suffering like it was a science experiment. You showed no remorse, no empathy, no recognition of the profound evil of what you attempted to do." The judge sentenced Sophie to 2 concurrent terms of 25 years to life for each count of attempted murder, the maximum allowed under law. Due to her age, she would be eligible for parole after serving 25 years, but Judge Morrison made clear she would personally recommend against parole at every hearing. "You will be 41 years old before you have even a chance at freedom," the judge said. "Perhaps by then you will have developed the capacity for remorse that you so clearly lack today." As bailiffs led Sophie Martinez out of the courtroom in handcuffs, she turned back one final time, her eyes finding Robert Chen, who sat in the gallery. For a long moment their eyes met, teacher and student, and in that exchange was a lifetime of betrayed trust and broken promise. Mr. Chen had done what justice demanded, but the cost to his faith in students, in his ability to see good in young people, was incalculable. He had taught Sophie chemistry, had helped develop her brilliant mind, never imagining he was equipping a killer with knowledge. In the aftermath, Robert Chen took a sabbatical from teaching, struggling with what signs he might have missed, what he might have done differently. But ultimately he returned to his classroom, carrying hard-won wisdom, that intelligence without empathy is not a gift, but a curse, that brilliance can serve evil as easily as good, and that sometimes the most important thing a teacher can do is not impart knowledge, but recognize when that knowledge is being turned toward darkness. Sophie Martinez would spend the next decades in a women's correctional facility, a cautionary tale of privilege corrupted by entitlement, of intelligence twisted into malevolence, and Robert Chen would continue teaching, forever vigilant, forever watching, forever haunted by the student whose research into chemistry became a blueprint for murder.